The men who worked for Emmett Castellano had a saying about him. He never raised his voice, because a man who raises his voice is afraid he won't be heard. At 34, he ran what his father left behind, and he ran it the way a surgeon runs an operating room, quietly, precisely, with no wasted motion. Dark hair cut short, gray eyes that gave nothing back. A black wool coat he wore like a closed door. So on the last cold Thursday of October, when his truck turned onto a gravel road in the Hudson Valley and headed toward a horse farm he hadn't set foot on in 9 years, the two men following him understood that something had gone very wrong, because Emmett Castellano didn't revisit his past. He expected rot. He expected silence. What he found was a light burning in the stable. He stood in the doorway and looked at a stall swept clean, a horse blanket folded into a bed, a hot plate wired into an outlet that shouldn't have had power, and surgical gauze washed and hung to dry on a line of baling twine. Someone was living in his barn. Then a voice came out of the dark behind the post, low and cracked and burning with fever. "Don't come any closer." She stepped into the light holding a rusty hay rake like a weapon. A woman, maybe 28, thin enough that her collarbones showed through a man's flannel shirt, 3 sizes too big. Brown hair pulled back with a rubber band. Her left hand wrapped in a bandage. She had clearly changed herself. Her hand shook. Her eyes didn't. Emmett had stood in rooms with men who wouldn't have hesitated to end him over the price of a used car, and he hadn't once blinked. But he had never stood in front of a person with nothing left to lose. And in that first silent second, watching her hold her ground in a place she had no right to be, he understood 2 things. This woman wasn't lost, and whatever had driven her here was still out there, and it was coming. If you love stories about second chances and about the people who show up when we have nothing left, hit that like button. It truly helps this channel grow. Share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And if you're new here, subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Now let's go back to that stable on a cold October night, where a powerful man and a desperate woman are about to change each other's lives forever. He didn't take another step. Instead, he pulled the truck keys from his jacket pocket, set them on top of the feed bin beside him, then sat down on the very same bin, resting both hands loosely on his knees where she could see them. That was his way of telling her that the only weapon inside this stable was already in her hands, and he wasn't going to fight her for it. "I'll stay right here," he said, his voice low and level, as still as water on a windless day. "You stay exactly where you are." She didn't lower the rusty hay rake. Several seconds slipped by. There was only the wind threading through the cracks in the wooden walls, and the sound of her breathing, shallow and uneven. "I'll leave as soon as it's daylight," she said. "You don't have to call anybody. I never said I was going to call anybody. Men like you don't have to say it." He tilted his head, a flicker of curiosity crossing his face. "And what kind of man is that?" "The kind who walks into the dark before turning on the flashlight on his phone." He said nothing. She'd been watching him since before he'd opened the door, and she was right. "What's your name?" "It doesn't matter. It does to me." "Then you'll have to live without knowing." He nodded, accepting the answer, and as he did, his eyes drifted to her left hand. The bandage was wrapped unevenly, the kind of dressing someone would put on with only one working hand. From beneath its edge, a thin streak of red climbed along the inside of her wrist, reaching almost to her elbow. He'd seen a red line like that once before on the arm of a dock worker, and that man had lost his hand. "Your hand's infected," he said. "I know. You know, and you're still standing here gripping a rusty piece of steel." "I know that too." There wasn't a trace of self-pity in her voice. It was simply another fact, spoken aloud and then left where it fell. He was beginning to understand that she wasn't afraid of the fever. She was calculating how much time she had left before it became too much for her legs to hold her up, and she was spending every remaining minute trying to keep him from going any farther. The only question was why. Then, from somewhere beyond the yard, a dry cough drifted through the darkness. 3 coughs. A pause. Then another fit, the kind that never quite emptied the lungs. Emmett turned toward the little house where the old caretaker he'd known 9 years earlier still lived, and he rose to his feet. She rushed in front of the stable door, moving far faster than anyone burning with that kind of fever should have been able to move, and for the first time that night, her voice broke into something entirely different. "Don't." It wasn't an order anymore. It was a plea. "He's asleep. He only just managed to fall asleep." Emmett looked at her, and something deep inside his chest shifted. "What are you afraid I'll find in there?" "I'm not afraid of what you'll see. she said. "I'm afraid you'll wake him up just to ask him who I am." He gently moved her arm aside, not roughly, but with quiet finality that didn't allow her to stop him, then crossed the yard. The door wasn't locked. Inside there was only a bed, a small wood stove, and the sharp scent of antiseptic mixed with dry hay. Otis Doyle lay beneath 2 heavy blankets, so thin that the bones of his cheeks pressed sharply against his skin, his silver hair damp and plastered across his forehead. But beside the bed, resting on a small wooden stool, was a sheet of cardboard ruled by hand into careful columns. Inside those columns were rows of temperatures, pulse readings, medicine schedules, every entry written neatly in blue ink, every dose given exactly on time, not a single line missed. Someone had sat beside that bed every single night. The old man opened his eyes. It took him a long moment to recognize the man standing at the foot of his bed. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't ask why he'd come back after all those years. The very first words that came from his cracked, ragged voice were words of protection. "If you throw that girl out," he whispered between strained breaths, "then throw me out too." Emmett stood without moving. Behind him, in the doorway, the young woman was still clutching the hay rake, and tears were running down her face before she'd even realized she was crying. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone. He didn't explain himself to anyone. He didn't ask for permission. He simply dialed a number and spoke exactly 3 things into the phone: the address, the condition, and 1 word: now. Then he ended the call, slipped off his jacket, and hung it on the hook behind the door, as though he'd just made the decision to stay. 40 minutes later, in a stretch of countryside where an ambulance would have taken more than an hour to crawl, bright headlights swept across the fence, and a doctor carrying a worn medical bag stepped into the yard. The young woman watched the scene unfold, then looked at the man sitting quietly in the corner of the room, and at last she understood that she'd just pointed a rusty hay rake at a man. The world itself obeyed the moment he spoke. The doctor tended to the old man first, then turned to her, and she let him cut the filthy bandage away from her left hand without making a sound. But the moment the needle pierced the back of her other hand, all the strength went out of her body, and she collapsed before anyone could catch her. She woke sometime later in a room she'd never entered before, beneath a heavy blanket, surrounded by a warm golden light she'd forgotten existed. Firewood crackled in the hearth. Water murmured somewhere inside the pipes. The ceiling light was on, truly bright, not like the dim bulb she'd rigged up in the stable. The main house had been opened and brought back to life, and in that blurred moment between sleep and waking, she thought she'd died and been carried by mistake to some decent place. Then her memory returned, and the first thing she did was bolt upright and search for her backpack. She didn't look for her phone. She didn't look for her shoes. She didn't ask where she was. She only swept the room with the panicked eyes of someone about to lose the last thing she had left. The backpack was at the foot of the bed, its zipper untouched, the knot exactly as she'd tied it with a shoelace. The man was sitting in a chair in the corner, his shirt sleeves rolled up, a cup of cold coffee beside him, and he'd clearly been there for a long time. "I put it there," he said. "I didn't open it." She pulled the bag into her lap, her fingers resting light and defensive over the worn canvas as she waited for what came next. "Why didn't you open it?" "Because searching someone else's bag only tells me what's inside the bag," he said. "I need to know what's inside their head. That, they have to tell me themselves." She sat without speaking for a very long time. Another piece of wood cracked in the fire. "Maeve," she said at last. "Maeve Sullivan." He gave a slow nod, and she understood immediately that she'd just given him something he already had. "I knew your name before dark," he said. "The moment I turned onto this road and saw someone living in my stable, I made a call. By the time I stepped through the door, I knew you were an emergency room nurse, that your nursing license had been suspended, that you were under investigation for the death of a patient, and that there was no longer any registered address under your name." She didn't deny it. She didn't lower her eyes either, and that was what caught his attention. "Then you already know everything," she said. "You want me to sit here and tell you your own story again?" "I don't know everything," he said. The patient's name was redacted from the file. Medical privacy law. It only says male patient, nearly 50 years old. The local newspapers did the same thing. They printed your picture, but they didn't print his name. Something passed across her face when he said that, so quickly that he couldn't read it, and she immediately looked down, tightening her grip on the canvas strap. "People only need one name to blame," she said. "A dead man's name doesn't sell newspapers." He let the words fall and didn't pick them up. "What's in there?" he asked, looking at the backpack. "Clothes, a few things. And something that makes you more afraid of me than you are of going hungry." Her breath caught, and her fingers froze against the fabric. She considered her answer for a long time, and he didn't press her. He simply remained where he was, as though he had the whole night, which he did. "The hospital keeps a medication dispensing log," she said at last. "It records which batch came in, who signed for it, who removed it, and how much remained. I kept a copy." "Where is that copy?" "I won't tell you." One of his eyebrows lifted, only slightly. "You're lying in my house, taking medicine I paid for, sleeping under my blanket." "Yes," she said. "And if I tell you where I hid it, then there won't be anything left that makes you need to keep me here." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she hadn't prepared herself for. He stood, picked up the cup of cold coffee, and walked toward the door, speaking over his shoulder in the same even voice he'd used while sitting on the feed bin. "Keep that hiding place to yourself. Get some sleep. Tomorrow morning, I have something I want to ask you, and right now you aren't awake enough to lie to me properly." But she didn't sleep, and he didn't go very far either. Just before dawn, when he came back to add more firewood to the hearth, she was sitting against the headboard with her eyes open, and she began to speak without waiting for him to ask a single question, as though during those long hours lying there, she'd decided it was better to tell the whole story once than to let someone else invent the parts that were missing. Her voice was even, flat, never rising or falling. The voice of someone who'd shed every tear she could ever cry over her own life a long time ago. And now all that remained was the telling. She said she'd never had parents in the way most people understood those words. She'd grown up in the foster care system, moving from one house to another so many times that there'd been a period when she hadn't even bothered unpacking her belongings anymore. She'd simply left everything inside the same canvas bag beneath the bed because it was easier that way. She spoke about those years as though she were describing the weather. Then she spoke about one woman. The woman had already been old when she'd taken Maeve in, her hands cracked from decades spent cooking in a school cafeteria. And she'd been the only person in the world who'd ever called Maeve her daughter. Not kid, not little girl, daughter. She taught her how to fold a blanket properly, how to say thank you with sincerity, and how to sit quietly beside someone who was hurting without feeling the need to fill the silence with words. When the old woman fell ill, Maeve was in her final year of school and working the night shift. She asked to switch every schedule she had to nights so she could spend the days sitting beside that bedside. She stayed there until the woman's very last breath, and she told Emmett that it was the only time in her entire life she'd ever felt she'd done something completely right. After that came years so long that she gathered them into a single sentence: working nights while studying, sleeping on the break room couch, taking exams with bloodshot eyes, until at last she'd earned her degree and a place in the emergency department. She said she loved that work. She said it was the only thing she'd ever owned that nobody had given her. Then she spoke about the medication vials. At first it had only been a feeling, the kind an experienced nurse had when she picked up a vial and somehow knew it wasn't right. Patients remained in pain when they should have found relief. Their fevers refused to break. Cases that should have begun improving within a few hours simply remained exactly where they'd been. She started keeping records. She compared batch numbers, incoming inventory, signed receipts, and the quantities left inside the medication cabinet. And the numbers didn't match. They failed to match with a consistency that was far too precise to be explained away as simple mistakes. She filed a report. She followed every procedure exactly as required, used the correct forms, submitted everything through the proper chain of command, and she still remembered how light she'd felt after pressing the send button, because she'd believed that from that moment forward, the burden no longer belonged to her alone. A few weeks later, during her shift, one of her patients stopped breathing. She slowed down slightly when she reached this part of the story, but her voice never trembled. She said she'd done everything that could possibly be done, and she'd held the man's hand, and he died just before dawn. 3 days later, they called her into the office. The electronic medical record stated that she'd entered the wrong dosage herself. Her electronic signature was there. The timestamp was there. Everything looked neat, clean, and flawless, without a single visible sign that anything had ever been altered. She said she'd stood inside that room listening while people read aloud words she'd never written, and the feeling had been like having her skin stripped away while not being allowed to cry out. Her nursing license was suspended. A local newspaper published her portrait, the photograph taken when she'd first entered the profession, her hair tied back neatly, smiling with the confidence of someone who believed the future would be kind. The man she'd been about to marry was the hospital's in-house attorney. He didn't shout. He didn't slam his fist onto the table. He didn't say a single cruel word. He simply handed back her engagement ring, told her he was sorry, and the following day sat on the opposite side of the conference table during the meeting, his eyes lowered to the stack of papers for the entire session. She said she wasn't angry with him anymore. She simply couldn't understand how someone could sleep at night after choosing a chair instead of choosing a human being. Emmett asked why she hadn't taken everything to the federal authorities. She looked at him and said she'd gone. Twice. The first time they listened to her for 40 minutes before asking what capacity she was appearing in, and once they learned she was the person under investigation, they wrote down her name, thanked her politely, and showed her to the door. The second time she brought the copy with her. They looked through the documents, asked how she'd obtained them, and when she told them the truth, they informed her that the papers wouldn't save her. Handing them over would only add one more criminal charge to her own file. "That's how it is," she said, her voice never rising even a single note. "I'm holding the one thing that can prove everything, and I'm the only person in the world who isn't allowed to use it." He didn't say anything for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice had changed. It no longer carried the calm restraint of a man asking questions. It carried the quiet stillness of a man making a confession. He said he'd once had a younger sister. She'd been 19, a college student in the city, and every weekend she'd come back because of the horses, because she'd loved the chestnut mare their father had planned to sell. One morning she'd called him and made him promise he'd drive up that very day. He'd promised. He hadn't come. Their father had needed him to handle something in the city, and he'd told himself next weekend would be fine, that she'd stay angry for 3 days and then forgive him. That afternoon, Otis called. His sister died in that very yard. He stopped there, offering no more details. He didn't explain how it had happened. He didn't say who'd found her first. He only said he'd driven there through the night, and he'd arrived too late. Maeve remained silent. She'd stood beside enough people who'd lost someone they loved to know that silence was the only kindness worth offering now. 3 months later, his father became ill. The old man spent nearly a month in bed, and during those final days, when the medication left his words confused, and he could no longer tell who was sitting beside him, he began repeating the same name over and over again, Doyle. Emmett had thought he was talking about the farm's caretaker, so he'd reassured him that Otis was fine, still living up there on the property. But his father shook his head, and during one rare moment of complete clarity, he finally told Emmett how their family had come to own this land. They hadn't bought it. It had been taken through a loan carefully designed so no one could ever repay it. Offered to a farmer desperate for money to pay for his wife's medical treatment, filled with terms the man had signed without reading to the end because he'd trusted the man sitting across the table. Otis Doyle's father had lost the land in a single afternoon. Along with it, he'd lost the only life he'd ever known as a farmer. Emmett said the old man had cried while telling him that story, and it was the only time in his entire life he'd ever seen his father cry. His father wanted him to make it right. He never said how. Then he died, and the name Doyle settled inside Emmett's chest, like a stone that couldn't be coughed back out. He continued, speaking even more slowly. He'd locked the gates to this farm and never returned. He'd continued paying Otis's wages every single month without missing once. He'd continued paying the veterinarian's bills for the horses. He'd kept the electricity connected to the little house for 9 straight years, and paid every utility bill without ever looking to see how much it was, never once wondering why some months cost more than others. "Tonight I walked into that stable," he said, "and I saw your little electric hot plate plugged into the outlet. Do you know what I thought? I didn't think someone was stealing my electricity. I thought, this place still has power. For 9 years I've been paying for an electric meter I never had the courage to come back and look at." He lowered his eyes to his hands. "People think I left this place to rot because I'm cruel. That's not the truth. I kept paying every bill because it was easier than remembering. I bought myself peace of mind every month, and I always paid exactly on time." Maeve watched the fire for a long while. "Then we're both hiding," she said. "The only difference is this. You're hiding from what you did. I'm hiding from what was done to me." He looked up at her, and he didn't argue. Outside, Dawn was beginning to break, bringing that bleak gray light that belonged to the end of October, and inside the little house across the yard, the doctor was packing away his equipment. Emmett rose, walked to the coat hanging behind the door, and pulled a stack of papers folded into thirds from the inside pocket. Maeve caught the bold words printed across the top of the first page. Transfer agreement. Beneath them were several blank lines waiting for signatures. "This is why I came here," he said. "Someone wants to buy this place. Once I sign these papers, I'll never have to think about it again. Once I sign them, Otis, the horses, and you, all of you become somebody else's responsibility." He carried the documents toward the fireplace. Maeve held her breath, certain he was about to throw them into the flames. He didn't. He laid them carefully on the mantel, smoothing them flat, then placed the pen neatly on top, as though it were nothing more than a paperweight. After that, he turned away. The papers remained there, untouched, without a single signature. By morning, Otis's fever had broken and he was finally asleep, while Maeve sat at the kitchen table with her left hand properly bandaged, eating her third spoonful of porridge with the careful slowness of someone afraid her stomach might have forgotten how to accept food. Emmett set a cup of coffee in front of her and took the chair across the table. "There's something I want to say," he told her. "Hear all of it before you answer." She lowered her spoon. "Your case," he said. "I can make it disappear. Not by manufacturing evidence. I don't do that. But there are people who sign papers. People who decide which files go to court and which ones disappear into a drawer. And I know some of them, and they owe me. It would only take a few weeks. You wouldn't have to do anything. You wouldn't have to appear in court or speak to anyone. One morning, you'd receive a letter telling you they'd decided not to prosecute, and the whole thing would be over." When he finished, he fell silent. He'd made that offer several times in his life, and not once had he ever waited longer than 3 seconds for an answer. Maeve looked at him for a long time. "What about my nursing license? That would take longer, but it can be done too." She nodded slowly, as though she were honestly considering it, and for one brief moment he thought the matter was settled. Then she said, "No." He didn't ask her to repeat herself. He simply sat there and waited. "Do you know what the worst part of what they did to me is?" she said. "It isn't losing my job. It isn't the photograph in the newspaper. It's that now I can't prove to anyone that I did the right thing. People look at me, and they don't know. I know, but what I know doesn't mean anything to anybody else." She pushed the bowl of porridge aside. "If you make a few phone calls and my case disappears, then for the rest of my life I'll be someone who was spared. Not someone who was innocent, someone who was spared. And anything that's been spared can always be dragged out and spared again. Or people can ask who spared you, and what you gave them in return." Emmett still said nothing. "Besides," she continued, and for the first time there was an edge in her voice, "there are other people too. You haven't asked me this, so I'll tell you now. That pharmacy wasn't stealing medication from only one person. There were patients lying in those beds in pain, while someone injected them with something that did nothing at all. There were mothers sitting beside their children, asking why they still weren't getting better. They don't need one nurse to have her charges erased. They need someone to stand up and say exactly what happened, and say it somewhere the truth will be entered into the record. If I take what you just offered me, I get saved, and they remain forgotten forever." She looked straight at him. "I carried that copy for thousands of miles. I slept in my car. Was all of that only so I could trade it for one peaceful morning for myself? Then what did I lose everything for?" The only sound left in the kitchen was water boiling on the stove. Emmett Castellano sat without moving, and something unfamiliar stirred inside his mind. So unfamiliar that it took him a moment to give it a name. He'd given money to many people. He'd watched them take it out of greed, take it out of fear, take it through tears, take it and curse him behind his back afterward. He'd never seen anyone push it back toward him without once looking over her shoulder to see what might be coming. She wasn't afraid of the consequences. She'd fallen so deep that there were no consequences left capable of reaching her. "All right," he said. "Then we'll do it another way." He reached for his coffee. "Otis can't take care of himself anymore. You know that better than I do. This farm needs someone who understands medication, can get up early, and doesn't talk too much to strangers. I'm hiring you. You'll be paid every month, and you'll have a room in the main house instead of sleeping in the stable. You work, I pay you, and neither of us owes the other a word of gratitude." She narrowed her eyes. "What's the condition?" "Only one," he said. 3 meals a day, and you finish every one of them. I hate sitting across from someone whose bones I can count. She opened her mouth to answer sharply, then stopped. She pulled the bowl of porridge back toward her. Those next few days passed with a slowness the city had long since forgotten. Maeve woke before dawn because her body had grown so accustomed to the night shift that it refused to forget it. She learned how to pitch hay, how to shovel manure from the sawdust bedding, and how to carry 2 buckets of water at the same time without spilling a drop. Otis sat in a weathered wooden chair at the head of the stable row, a blanket draped across his legs, teaching her each task in a voice that was still rough from his illness. There were 4 horses in the barn, and the last one was the oldest, a chestnut whose muzzle had faded gray with age, and whose left eye had gone completely blind. Otis told her no one had been able to touch that horse for years, not even him. Every time he changed its water, he had to circle around to the other side of the stall. On Tuesday morning, Maeve stood in the doorway of the stall, without reaching toward the horse, and without saying a word. She simply stood there for nearly half an hour with the water bucket in her hands. The horse slowly turned its head, studying her for a long time with its one good eye, then walked over and gently rested its nose against her shoulder. Outside, Otis forgot to breathe for a moment. He didn't say a word, but that afternoon, for the first time since falling ill, he began whistling while brushing the old chestnut's coat. An old tune, broken now and then because his lungs were still weak, but it was whistling all the same. Emmett stayed the first night because the doctor had told him the old man needed watching for several more days. Then he stayed another night. Then he stayed the rest of the week, and no one inside the house ever mentioned it. The thing that did change was that every afternoon another vehicle arrived. A gray-haired man drove 2 hours from the city carrying a leather briefcase, sat at the kitchen table for about 20 minutes, while Emmett signed a stack of documents, drank a cup of coffee, then drove another 2 hours back to the city. Maeve watched that same routine repeat itself 3 times in a single week, and slowly realized the man splitting firewood in the yard hadn't taken time away from work at all. He'd simply brought his work with him. She also began noticing the vehicles parked along the fence. They weren't always there. They only appeared on the nights Emmett stayed. They parked a short distance from the gate with their lights off, and by morning they'd vanished. She asked Otis about them, and he only shrugged, saying that was how things had always been with the boy. The first evening all 3 of them sat down at the same table was a Friday night. Maeve cooked, partly because it was part of her job, and partly because she couldn't bear watching 2 grown men eat sandwiches standing beside the stove. Otis insisted on getting out of bed, taking his cane, walking all the way across the yard, and settling into the chair at the head of the table as though he'd occupied that place his entire life. Supper was simple: potatoes, beef stew, and a loaf of bread bought in town. Nobody talked about anything important. Otis told the story of how his father had once planted a row of apple trees along the eastern fence, and how the horses used to stretch their necks through the rails to steal the fruit, and he laughed. Emmett laughed too. Just once. A short laugh, almost like someone caught by surprise. Maeve sat there watching those 2 men laugh beneath the warm kitchen light, and realized she hadn't shared a dinner table with more than one other person since the day the old woman who'd called her daughter closed her eyes for. The last time. She lowered her head and kept eating so no one would see her face. Her shoes gave out in the middle of the following week. They were the same nursing shoes she'd worn since her days in the emergency department. Their white soles had long since yellowed, and now the front of the left shoe had split wide open. She tied it together with a piece of rough twine she found in the tack room, pulling it tight and knotting it across the top of her foot, and she walked that way for several days, crossing muddy ground, standing inside the stable, never saying a single word to anyone about it. She didn't think anyone had even noticed. Early Saturday morning, when she stepped outside to open the stable before sunrise while the sky was still gray, a box sat neatly on the wooden step outside the door. A shoebox. Inside was a pair of low-cut suede work boots with sturdy rubber soles, exactly her size. The tissue paper still folded neatly inside them. There was no letter, no note, no name. Maeve stood there staring at the box for a very long time. Then she slowly sat down on the dew-damp wooden step, pulled the box into her lap, wrapped both arms around it, and cried. She cried without making a sound, her shoulders trembling beneath the flannel shirt that was 3 sizes too large for her. And she cried for a very long time, far longer than a pair of boots deserved, because it had been so many years since anyone in this world had bought her anything at all. She never thanked him. He never mentioned the boots either. That Monday afternoon, Maeve walked around to the back of the main house to collect a stack of wooden planks for the stable, and she stopped at the corner of the wall when she saw two men she'd never seen before standing in the yard. They were beside a car whose engine was still running. Emmett stood on the front steps with his hands in his pockets, making no move to invite either man inside. The older of the two carried a black briefcase, and he lowered it onto the step at Emmett's feet with both hands, the way people set something down when they don't dare place it directly into another person's hands. He said a few words that Maeve couldn't make out, but she recognized his voice. She'd heard that voice many times in the emergency department, from family members waiting in hospital corridors, the voice of someone trying desperately to keep it steady, even as it trembled at the end of every sentence. Then the man said, "Mr. Castellano," lowered his head, and both men climbed back into the car and drove away. Emmett bent down to pick up the briefcase, and when he turned around, he found Maeve standing at the corner of the house with the stack of boards in her arms. She didn't pretend she'd only just arrived. "That's what they call you," she said. "It is. What do you do for a living?" He didn't answer immediately. He walked down the steps, placed the briefcase on top of the water barrel, and stood facing her in the middle of the yard. "If I answer that question directly," he said, "you'll be through the gate before I've even finished the sentence. So I won't answer it. I'll let you see for yourself. Stay here as long as you want. Watch whatever you want. And when you decide you've seen enough, you'll come to your own conclusion. That conclusion will belong to you, not to something I put into your head." Then I guessed right. "You haven't told me what you guessed." "I don't have to," she replied. "There are 4 vehicles parked along the fence every night you stay here. A man drives 2 hours just so you can sign paperwork. 2 men just left a briefcase on your doorstep because they didn't dare hand it to you directly. And on the very first night, in the middle of nowhere, where an ambulance would have taken more than an hour to get here, you made 1 phone call, and a doctor showed up." He nodded, accepting every word without trying to deny a single one. "I inherited what my father left behind," he said. "I didn't choose it, but I kept it. And after keeping it this many years, I don't get to claim I'm innocent anymore. For the past several years, I've been pulling everything I can toward the legal side. Whatever can be abandoned gets abandoned. Whatever stays has to be clean. That takes years, not months." He looked straight into her eyes. "But there's something I want you to know now, so you won't be disappointed later. Trying to do that doesn't make me a good man. It only means I don't want other people's children paying the price for the money I earned. I've never pretended to be a decent man, and I'm not about to start pretending in front of you." Maeve stood there for a long time, the stack of boards growing heavier in her arms. "I like this place," she finally said. "I like Otis. I like the blind horse. Do you know what's dangerous about that?" "What?" "I'm starting to forget I'm only here temporarily." She turned away and carried the boards toward the stable. That night, after supper, she sat alone in the tack room and took an old tin box of horse brushes down from the shelf. She opened it. At the bottom of the box, beneath the worn brushes, lay the photocopied documents she'd carried with her for 11 months. She'd planned to bring them into the main house that night. She'd spent the entire afternoon thinking that if there was one person in this world powerful enough to make those papers reach the place they truly needed to reach, it was the man sitting in the kitchen. She picked them up, felt her hands begin to shake, then slowly laid them back down, placed the old brushes over them, closed the lid, and returned the box to exactly the same place on the shelf. Once before, she'd entrusted the most important thing in her life to another person. That person had been a lawyer, and that same lawyer had ended up sitting on the opposite side of the table. That night, she slept out in the stable on an old horse blanket, even though there was a bed waiting for her inside the main house. The following morning, she was still there because it was time to change Otis's bandages, and she'd never once missed the hour for changing them. The gray sedan stopped outside the gate late one afternoon, parked entirely on the road instead of edging onto the gravel drive, and the man who stepped out was the kind of person who understood that doing so was more polite. He was around 40, dressed in a neat wool coat, his hair carefully combed, a small notebook in one hand. He didn't walk straight into the yard. He remained outside the gate and called in, waited until someone came to open it, then stepped forward and offered Otis his business card with both hands. Maeve was inside the tack room. She heard his voice, looked through the narrow crack beside the door, and her whole body went rigid as though someone had poured ice water down her spine. She backed away from the opening, sank onto the concrete floor, and wrapped both arms around her knees. Outside, the man spoke in the gentlest voice imaginable. He said he was helping a family search for a relative. A woman nearing 30, possibly struggling with her mental health, had left home without telling anyone. Her family was deeply worried. They didn't want to involve the police because they were afraid she might panic. They only wanted to know she was still safe. He used the word safe twice. Otis lifted the business card, held it at arm's length, and read it very slowly, like a confused old man whose eyesight was failing. Then he handed it back and said there was no one there except him and the horses, that nobody came up this time of year because the road was too muddy, and that a veterinary truck had gotten stuck a few days earlier and had to be pulled free. He went on to tell the man about the broken water pump and the price of heating oil that year. He spoke without pause, relaxed and tedious, exactly like an old man who hadn't had anyone to talk to in a very long time. The visitor thanked him, told him to call if he saw anyone unfamiliar, then returned to his car and drove away. Emmett had been standing on the porch of the main house from the beginning, never saying a word. When the sedan disappeared around the bend, he turned toward the old man and looked at him a second time, longer than the first. "You lie remarkably well," he said. Otis slipped the business card into the breast pocket of his shirt. "I didn't lie about anything," he replied. "There's only me and the horses here. The girl is family now." That evening, Emmett drove away without saying where he was going. The man named Dale Frayne was renting a room in a 2-story motel at the edge of town, the last room at the end of the corridor, with a window overlooking the parking lot. He opened the door after 3 evenly spaced knocks and found a man in a black wool coat standing outside, empty-handed. Emmett didn't enter. He remained on the other side of the threshold. "I won't keep you long," he said. His voice was as ordinary as though he were asking the time. He drew a thin envelope from the inside of his coat, so thin it appeared to contain no more than 1 or 2 sheets of paper, and held it out. Frayne looked at it but didn't reach for it. "Take it," Emmett said. "It isn't money." Frayne accepted the envelope, opened it, and removed 2 documents. The first was a copy of the mortgage agreement for his suburban home, complete with the file number, payment term, outstanding balance, and his wife's name signed beside his own. The second was a notice stating that the loan had been transferred from the bank to an investment company Frayne had never heard of. The date printed on the page was 3 days earlier. He read both documents twice. His expression didn't change immediately. It took a moment for the blood to drain from his face. "I'm not threatening you," Emmett said. "Think carefully. I haven't said a single thing since I arrived that could be written down as a threat. I've only handed you paperwork, legal paperwork, a legal purchase. Banks sell debt every day. It's an ordinary transaction." He paused. "There's only one thing I want you to understand. Beginning Monday morning, the person you and your wife will be paying your mortgage to every month is me. The roof you're sleeping beneath tonight is sitting in the drawer of my desk. I'm not asking you for a single cent beyond what you already owe. I won't call you. You keep making the payments exactly as you've always made them." Frayne opened his mouth, then closed it again. "Go back and give the person who hired you one message," Emmett said. "She's under my roof." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned, walked the full length of the corridor, and by the time he reached the parking lot, a fine rain had begun to fall. In the last room at the end of the hall, Dale Frayne remained standing with the 2 documents in his hands, and it was a long time before he realized he still hadn't closed the door. 4 days later, a black luxury car crept up the gravel drive in broad daylight, stopped in the middle of the yard, and a silver-haired man with neatly combed hair stepped out, wearing an overcoat and carrying a leather briefcase. He'd driven himself. No one was with him. He stood in the yard and looked around with the satisfied expression of a man touring a property, then walked up onto the porch and extended his hand before anyone could ask who he was. "Curtis Halloway," he said. "I work at Mercy General. I came up here to speak with Miss Sullivan, if she'll allow it." Maeve was standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in her hands. Her whole body went cold, but she didn't step back. Emmett came out onto the porch, didn't take the man's hand, and merely nodded toward the wicker chair in the corner. Without being asked, Otis went into the kitchen and returned with a pot of coffee and 3 cups. He filled the guest's cup first, pouring very slowly. Halloway thanked him in the warm voice of a man accustomed to giving speeches at fundraisers, and he sincerely complimented the coffee. Then he opened his briefcase. "I won't waste your time," he said to Maeve. "You're in a very difficult position, and I don't like seeing people remain in difficult positions longer than necessary. So I drove 2 hours up here, alone, to offer you a way out." He arranged the documents on the table, perfectly straight, one sheet at a time. You sign a confidentiality agreement. You return the copy of the medication dispensing log, along with every related document you're holding. In exchange, we withdraw every complaint, and the prosecutor's office won't pursue the case any further. I can guarantee that. The nursing board in the neighboring state will reconsider your file within 1 quarter, and I know people there. You'll be allowed to practice again. Perhaps not here, but somewhere no one recognizes your face. He removed the final sheet, set it down, and turned it so she could read it. And this is transitional assistance. Enough to give you a place to live, a car, and time to breathe. Maeve looked at the amount printed on the check. It was more money than everything she'd ever earned in her life combined. You're thinking this is a purchase, Holloway said gently, as though he'd read the thought in her mind and found it pitiable. Miss Sullivan, I've worked in this profession longer than you've been alive. I've signed more people out the door than the number of patients you've ever cared for. Do you know how many of them were named in the newspapers? Not one. He took another sip of coffee. You believe truth is something that rises on its own. It isn't. Truth is what lies at the bottom, and it only rises when someone pays to lift it. Lawyers cost money. Expert witnesses cost money. Time costs money. My side has all of those things. You, on the other hand, are sleeping by someone else's kindness on a farm that isn't in your name, and there isn't a single person in this world spending money on your behalf. Maeve turned to look at Emmett. He was sitting on the porch step with his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the yard. He didn't say anything. He didn't look at her either. She understood then that he was doing it deliberately, that he wouldn't speak a single word because this wasn't his decision, and because if he answered for her, she would remain forever someone other people answered for. She turned back to the check. Then she placed 2 fingers against the edge of the paper and slid it across the table toward Holloway. Do you know what I've managed to do for the past 11 months? She said. I didn't see a doctor. I didn't repair my car. I couldn't afford a new pair of shoes. I managed exactly one thing. Every morning, I woke up and didn't trade what I was carrying for a meal. That is everything I own, sir. You just told me no one is spending money on me. That's true, but no one has been able to buy me either, and between those 2 things, I'll keep the second. Holloway looked at her, and he didn't become angry. He nodded thoughtfully, gathered the papers, stacked them neatly inside the briefcase, fastened the locks, and rose to his feet. The smile never left his face. I'm very sorry, he said. You were a good nurse. I mean that. I've read your file. He buttoned his overcoat, thanked Otis for the coffee, then walked down the porch steps. After several paces, he stopped and turned back, his voice still as warm as it had been when he arrived. Miss Sullivan, I'm only saying this as someone who works in the field. Every case has a point when intervention can still save it. Once that point passes, all that's left is palliative care. You just let your moment pass. The black car had barely disappeared around the bend when Emmett rose from the porch steps. He didn't say a word. He walked into the house, took the black wool sweater hanging behind the door, slipped it on, picked up the keys from the ceramic bowl on the kitchen table, and stepped back outside. He didn't move any faster than usual through any part of it, and that was exactly what made Maeve drop the dish towel and run after him. She reached him just as he opened the driver's door. She stepped in front of him, leaned her back against the truck, and gripped the edge of the open door with both hands. Where are you going? Go back inside. It's cold. Where are you going? He looked at her. There was no anger in his eyes, no agitation, only a calmness that had already settled into place long before this moment. And Maeve realized that was the most frightening expression she'd ever seen on another human face. He drove 2 hours to come all the way up here, Emmett said. Alone. He didn't bring anyone with him. Do you know what that means? It means he isn't afraid. It means he doesn't think this is a place worth being afraid of. I need to change that. No. She spoke the single word without moving away from the truck door. Listen to everything I have to say first. If you do what you're planning to do, then what happens? He disappears. Then what? The hospital releases a statement expressing its sorrow. People leave flowers in the lobby. And the medication cabinet on the 4th floor stays exactly where it is, with somebody else holding the key. As for me, I'm still the nurse who entered the wrong dosage. Her voice broke, and this time she let it break. I don't need him to disappear. I need people to know the names. Not my name. The names of the people on that list. There was an elderly woman in the last room at the end of the hall whose daughter asked me every single day why her mother was still in so much pain. There was a welder with a severe leg infection who lay there for nearly 3 weeks. Right now they're nothing more than a few lines inside a notebook, nothing more than batch numbers and dates. If you kill him tonight, they'll remain inside that notebook forever. No one will ever read their names aloud. No one will ever record them in the official record. No one will ever apologize to them. She was breathing hard as the first scattered snowflakes settled onto her shoulders. If you really want to help me, then don't take away the only thing I still want. I want a courtroom. I want someone sitting there taking down every word, and I want someone to read those names out loud. Emmett stood perfectly still. Snow settled across his shoulders, gathering there without melting. He remained motionless so long that Maeve heard the heating system inside the main house switch on, and then fall silent again. At last, he reached past her shoulder, gently closed the truck door, slipped the keys back into his pocket, and turned toward the house. In his entire life, no one had ever changed his mind without using force, and he realized that the moment he stepped back onto the porch, that night the snow truly came, the first storm of the season, thick and silent. Close to midnight, the old chestnut horse kicked apart a section of the fence in the corner of the yard, and the two of them went outside to repair it. Maeve carried the flashlight. Emmett held the wooden rails in place. Snow gathered white across the backs of both their hands. They worked for nearly half an hour without speaking, accompanied only by the sound of the hammer and the clouds of breath rising into the frozen air. When the final rail had been nailed into place, Maeve lowered the flashlight, and its beam swept across his face. She stood there looking at him, and she didn't look away. He leaned down slowly enough for her to step back if she'd wanted to. She didn't. The kiss was brief, cold with snow. And afterward, they both remained standing there for a long while, as though they'd nearly dropped something impossibly fragile, and were quietly grateful it hadn't shattered. "There's something I have to tell you," she said softly, her eyes still fixed on the repaired fence. "People always think my greatest fear is losing everything. It isn't. I've already lost everything. Once you've lost it all, the fear disappears because there's nothing left anyone can take from you. It's strangely light. You wouldn't understand. It's so light that it's terrifying." She slowly lifted her eyes. "What I'm afraid of is beginning to have things again. Because once you have something again, you have something you can lose again. And I'm not sure I'd be able to stand back up one more time." He didn't make her any promises. He simply reached up, brushed the snow from her hair, then took the flashlight gently from her hand and lit the path for her as she walked back toward the house. The following afternoon, Maeve carried a tray of medicine and a glass of water to the small house at the far end of the yard. Otis was sitting with his back to the door, carefully rubbing oil into several leather reins draped over the back of his chair. It wasn't fully dark yet, but he'd already turned on the table lamp, and in its warm yellow glow, Maeve noticed the low wooden cabinet against the wall. On top of it stood several framed photographs that were usually hidden behind a stack of blankets. That day, the blankets had been folded and put away. She saw the photograph in the center. A middle-aged man with thinning hair wore a faded baseball cap and smiled with slightly crooked teeth, one hand resting against the neck of the chestnut horse. The glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the concrete floor. She didn't bend down to pick it up. She stood there listening to her heartbeat pounding inside her ears, because she'd stared at that face for hours during one late summer night, and she'd held that same hand until it turned cold. Otis didn't turn around. He set the rein down slowly and spoke into the empty space in front of him. "I've been wondering when you'd finally see it." Maeve couldn't speak. "I knew who you were from the day you walked through the gate," he said. "Do you remember that day? You came in from the main road on foot, soaked through, and asked if you could stay for a while. The moment I saw your face, I knew." He braced his hands against his knees and turned the chair around. His expression was completely calm. "I went down there for some of those hearings. I sat in the very last row. I listened while they read the file aloud. I heard them say you'd entered the wrong dosage. I heard that lawyer call my son the patient. They called you the woman who killed my son. Those were the exact words they used." Maeve reached out and gripped the doorframe. "But there was one thing no one ever entered into the record," Otis said. "During the recess, you were standing in the hallway, and you told the woman with you that you were sorry you hadn't stayed longer. You said you should have stayed another half hour, I was standing about 3 steps away. I heard every word. He looked at her. For all those weeks my son lay in that enormous hospital. Everyone called him Bed 12. Every person who came and went called him Bed 12. You were the only one who called him Mr. Doyle. Then later, you called him Harlan. He said it with the same calmness someone might use when speaking about the weather. And that was what brought Maeve to her knees. She sank onto the floor among the broken glass, covered her face with both hands, and for the first time since that night, she cried aloud. The old man let her cry. He didn't stand. He didn't comfort her. He didn't say a word. He simply waited. When she was finally able to raise her head, she wiped her face with her sleeve, stood, walked out to the stable, then returned carrying a small canvas pouch she'd taken from the bottom of her backpack. She placed it on the table in front of him. Inside was an old wristwatch with a cracked leather strap and a sheet of paper folded into quarters, only partly written in blue ink, the handwriting slanted and trembling. He woke up that night, Maeve said, her voice raw. He told me to open the drawer and take out the watch. He said it had belonged to your father, and that I had to bring it back to his father, that his father was up at the farm, and I had to place it directly into his hands. Then he asked for paper and a pen. He managed to write half a page before he became too tired and had to lie back down. He said he'd finish it tomorrow. She rested her hand on the folded page. There wasn't a tomorrow. Otis looked at the watch, but he didn't reach for it. I planned to mail it, she said. Then my license was suspended. Then the newspaper printed my picture. I thought that if I sent it here, you'd open the package and see that the sender was the woman the whole city said had killed your son. I couldn't do it. I kept it with me. I carried it in my car, and then I carried it even after I didn't have a car anymore. She swallowed. I walked here to give this to you, and then I was going to leave. I meant to tell you everything and go that same day. But when I reached the yard, I found you lying on the floor of the stable. She straightened, though her hands were trembling. I'll leave now. I'm sorry. I should have told you from the beginning. She turned away. Otis reached out and closed his hand around her wrist. His hand was thin and dry, but his grip was firm. Sit down, he said. She didn't sit. I've already lost my son, he said, still speaking with that same gentleness. Are you planning to take away the only person left in this house too? That night, the wind swept down into the valley shortly after dusk, the dry wind that always came at the end of autumn, striking in fierce gusts that made the sheets of tin on the hay barn roof rattle without stopping. Emmett had left earlier that afternoon, driving into town to meet with someone at the title office, and he wasn't expected back until late that evening. Otis walked over to the storage shed to retrieve the medicine box Maeve had accidentally left on the shelf that afternoon. Maeve was washing dishes in the kitchen when she noticed the light outside the window change. It wasn't moonlight. It wasn't the glow of porch lamps. It was the deep orange light that never belonged to the night. She ran into the yard and saw smoke rolling upward from the roof of the hay barn, while flames licked along the stacks of dried hay inside. She didn't stop to think. She charged through the barn door, keeping low beneath the smoke, calling Otis's name until she found him struggling in the far left corner, still clutching the medicine box, coughing violently and unable to find the way out because the smoke had swallowed the entire exit. She slipped an arm beneath his shoulder, pulled him backward with all her strength, and when they finally stumbled into the yard, she lowered him onto the front steps of the main house, shoved a damp cloth into his hands, and told him to breathe through it. Then she turned around. The horse stable was connected to one end of the hay barn, and the fire was already racing across the roof. She sprinted along the row of stalls, throwing back each latch, untying each lead, and driving 3 of the horses toward the eastern paddock. The old chestnut, blind in one eye, was the last and the hardest. It refused to move because it couldn't see anything on its left side. Maeve pulled off her coat, draped it gently over the horse's eyes, rested her cheek against its neck, and whispered something into its ear that no one else ever heard. Then she led it forward, one careful step at a time, out of the stable, across the yard, and all the way to the paddock fence. She had just finished tying the lead when, behind her, the end section of the roof collapsed with a deafening crash. Emmett's truck turned onto the gravel drive at that exact moment. He'd seen the orange glow from the main road and had driven the final 2 miles at full speed. Before the truck had even come to a complete stop, he threw open the door and jumped out, and years later the 2 men assigned to watch over him, who'd been sitting inside the vehicle parked along the fence, would both say it was the only time in all those years they'd ever seen their employer lose every trace of his composure. He shouted her name across the yard. He shouted it 3 times, his voice breaking apart, running toward the main house before spinning back toward the burning stable, and only when Otis raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the paddock did Emmett finally see her standing against the fence, her clothes blackened with soot, her left hand pressed tightly against her stomach. He ran to her and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly that she cried out in pain. The town's fire department arrived about 20 minutes later. They managed to save the stable, but the hay barn was gone. At the county hospital, they cleaned and bandaged her left hand where she'd grabbed the scorching hot iron latch, then placed her on oxygen because she'd inhaled too much smoke. Otis was admitted overnight so they could monitor his lungs. Near dawn, when the hallway had finally grown quiet, Emmett pulled a chair close beside her bed. She tried to lift the glass of water herself but couldn't. Both of her hands were trembling too badly, so he took the spoon instead and fed her one careful sip at a time. His hands were shaking too. She noticed it and said nothing. "Many years ago," he said, staring into the glass of water, "I promised my little sister I'd drive up to see her. I arrived several hours too late. For all these years I've replayed those missing hours over and over again. I've calculated 1,000 times what time I would have arrived if I'd left sooner." He slowly lowered the spoon. "Tonight I came home 4 minutes late. Just 4 minutes. I turned through the gate and saw the roof collapse. And during those 4 minutes, I didn't know whether you were still inside or already out." He looked up at her, and whether his eyes were red from the smoke or from something else, she couldn't tell. "I managed to live with those lost hours. If I had to survive another 4 minutes like tonight, I wouldn't survive them." Voices drifted through the hallway outside. One investigator from the County Fire Investigation Unit was taking notes while speaking with the town's police chief, and through the crack in the door Maeve caught fragments of their conversation. The electrical line leading into the barn had been disconnected at the breaker since the beginning of the season. The fire had started outside, near the end wall, where no electrical wiring ran at all. They used the one word she feared most: deliberate. She lay there listening until every word had been spoken. Then another thought came to her, slower than the first, and it sent a chill through her entire body. The hay barn had been connected directly to the tack room. On the shelf inside the tack room sat an old tin box filled with horsebrushes, and at the very bottom of that tin box was everything she still had left in the world. 3 days later, while Maeve was still in the hospital and Otis had already been discharged, Emmett sat inside his office in the city, with a thick file spread across the desk in front of him. He didn't go looking for the person who'd set the barn on fire. He gave that task to someone else. He went looking for the route those medication batches had taken because he'd listened when she spoke about lot numbers and delivery dates, and in his experience, there was one thing that always led to the truth faster than testimony ever could. Shipping records. The medication had to be kept cold. There weren't many refrigerated trucks. He had his people trace the route backward from the hospital pharmacy to the delivery company, then from the delivery company to the transportation contractor. The name on the 3rd page belonged to a refrigerated freight company with a warehouse north of the city. He knew that name. He'd approved its budget every quarter for years. It belonged to his family. He sat motionless in that room for a very long time. Then he called Gideon Marsh upstairs. The gray-haired man entered, set down his briefcase, looked at the file on the desk, and understood immediately. He didn't run. He pulled out a chair and sat down. Emmett asked him 3 questions. The first was it you? Gideon said yes. The second was, how long? Gideon said several years. Ever since the winter, Emmett had ordered all the old routes shut down. The third was, did you know what was inside those shipments? Gideon remained silent for a moment, then said that he did. Emmett didn't ask another question, and Gideon didn't lie about a single thing, because in the world where the two of them had grown up, lying to the man sitting across from you was considered worse than betraying him. Explain it, Emmett said. Gideon placed both hands on the desk, the same hands that had taught Emmett how to drive when he was a teenager, sitting in the man's lap in the dirt lot behind the warehouse. You came back and said everything would be clean from then on, Gideon said. You said we were closing this route, shutting down that place, cutting off something else. You said all of it in one afternoon, sitting in the same chair you're sitting in now. Then you left. You weren't the one standing in front of an entire block of workers the next morning, telling them there wouldn't be jobs for them the following month. I was. I looked every one of them in the face, Some of them had worked for your father since I was young. Some of them supported whole families on those wages. He lifted his eyes. You sat on top of the mountain of money the old man left behind and decided you wanted to become decent. What was I supposed to use to feed everyone else? Emmett listened to every word. Then he rose, walked to the window, and stood there with his back turned. Do you know the most frightening thing about what you just said? He asked. You're right. He turned around. You're finished as of today. Leave this city. Go wherever you want. I don't care. I'll pay you everything you're owed for those years, down to the last dollar, transferred into your account exactly as it is every month. Gideon looked up, unable to understand. What are you going to do to me? Nothing, Emmett said. I'm not going to do anything to you. You keep living. You spend that money. And every time you spend it, remember for me how you earned it. Gideon remained in the chair a while longer. Then he stood. And when he reached the doorway, he had to brace himself against the frame. That night, Emmett drove back to the farm. Maeve had returned and was sitting at the kitchen table with her hand wrapped in bandages. He pulled out the chair across from her and told her everything, hiding nothing, leaving out no detail that might have made him look less guilty. He told her the company's name. He told her how many years it had been happening. He even repeated what Gideon had said about the entire block of workers. Then he spoke the final words, looking directly into her eyes as he said them. The truck that delivered those medication batches to your hospital belonged to my family. I destroyed your life before I even knew you existed. Maeve sat without moving. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She didn't ask him to repeat a single thing. She only rose very slowly, walked into her room, and he heard the zipper of her backpack. She came back out with the bag over her shoulder and stopped in the kitchen doorway. Tell Otis I'm sorry, she said. Her voice was ordinary and level, the same voice she'd once used when reading vital signs to a physician. I've already divided his medication into the 7-compartment box on top of the refrigerator. The blue compartment is for the morning. Then she walked toward the door. He didn't stop her, because he knew he no longer had any right to keep her there. The only person Maeve could still call was Bernadette Kowalski, a nurse from her old shift, the woman who'd sent her exactly one message after everything happened. And that message had contained only 2 words. I believe. Bernie lived in a 3rd-floor apartment on the edge of the city, and she cleared off the sofa for Maeve without asking a single question. It wasn't until the second night, after she'd drunk half a bottle of cheap wine, that Bernie finally spoke. She said there was something she'd been keeping for nearly a year, something she hadn't dared tell anyone. Not even Maeve. Especially not Maeve. The night Mr. Doyle died. There'd been a network failure on the 4th floor, and the pharmacy camera system had switched to recording on a backup hard drive in the technical room instead of uploading to the server. Bernie had been the one sent to retrieve the timekeeping data the following day, and she'd copied the entire recording from that night shift onto a memory card, taken it home, and hidden it inside her sewing box. She said she'd meant to give it to someone. She'd meant to give it to Maeve for an entire year. Then another nurse was fired for some meaningless reason, and Bernie saw Maeve's photograph in the newspaper. And she thought about her 2 children and the mortgage on her home, and every time she finished thinking, the sewing box was pushed a little farther into the back of the closet. Maeve watched the recording on Bernie's laptop while sitting on the floor, her bandaged hand resting in her lap. The footage was black and white, filmed from a high angle, with no sound. In the middle of the shift, someone entered the pharmacy, opened the medication refrigerator, and stood there for a long time, with several vials in a tray, doing something careful and precise that the camera wasn't sharp enough to reveal clearly. Then the person closed the refrigerator and walked out. They had an access card. They knew the door code. They weren't in any hurry. Maeve froze the image, enlarged it, and recognized the person. Then she continued the recording, and her heart stumbled. 30 minutes later, the pharmacy door opened again, and the person who entered was Maeve herself. She stood there, removed a vial from the refrigerator, signed the log, and left. She remembered that trip to the pharmacy. She remembered moving quickly, because another emergency was unfolding in the hallway. But on the screen, beneath the harsh white lighting and the camera's downward angle, she didn't look like someone in a hurry. She looked like someone who entered and left that room with practiced familiarity. Alone, in the middle of the night, 30 minutes after the other person. Maeve sat without speaking for a long time. Do you understand? She said. This footage can save me, and it can bury me too. It depends on who shows it, and who stands beside the screen pointing. Bernie went pale. If they get it first, Maeve continued, they only have to cut out the part with me in it. They'll say, here she is entering the pharmacy alone at midnight. This is the final proof. As for the other person, they'll say it was an employee performing a routine inspection, and they'll have an assignment sheet to prove it. She closed the laptop. For this footage to mean anything, someone has to prove what that person was doing and where the medication went. There have to be shipping records. There has to be a company in the middle. Without that, this is only two people entering a pharmacy to retrieve medication during a busy night. Bernie asked who could possibly obtain those records. Maeve didn't answer. The following morning, she took the earliest bus heading north, then caught a ride from a milk delivery driver traveling from town, and walked the final stretch through the iron gate shortly before noon. Emmett was in the yard with two workers, clearing the burned foundation of the hay barn. When he saw her, he straightened, but didn't walk toward her. She went to him, set her backpack on the ground, and looked directly into his eyes. I didn't come back because I've forgiven you, she said. I haven't. Maybe I never will. I don't know that yet. He nodded and waited. I came back because I need you, she said. I'm holding something that will destroy me if it falls into the wrong hands. And the only person in the world who can turn it into something that saves me is the same man whose family truck carried those drugs to my hospital. She picked up her backpack. Can you make that right? The old safe sat in the basement of the main house beneath a dust-covered tarp, and Emmett had to call a locksmith because the combination had died with the man who'd created it. There was no cash inside. No gold. Only ledgers. Heavy hardbound ledgers with cloth spines, stacked year by year, filled with his father's slanted, razor-sharp handwriting, recording every shipment, every payment, every name. He remained down there through the entire night and well into the following morning, working backward from the newest volume to the oldest, searching for the first trace of the refrigerated transport route, trying to discover where it had all begun. He found it in the very last ledger at the bottom of the stack, so old that the edges of its pages had already turned brown with age. On one page was a handwritten list of stopping points, stretching from the northern border down toward the city, each location marked with its mileage. Between two of those points lay an unusually long gap, longer than refrigerated cargo could safely travel without being transferred or temporarily stored. Beneath that entry, his father had written a single sentence, underlined twice. A cold storage facility is needed here. Private land, private road, no curious eyes. The following page held a folded sheet of yellowed paper fastened into the spine of the ledger. It was a memorandum concerning a loan. The borrower's name was Doyle. The address was the address of this very farm. Written in the margin, in that same slanted, razor-sharp handwriting, were several additional words. Done. Begin construction of the cold storage foundation next quarter. Emmett read that sentence 3 times. He knew that cold storage building. It stood in the northeastern corner of the property. A thick concrete foundation surrounded by heavy walls that he'd believed since childhood had been nothing more than an old potato cellar. It had been abandoned years earlier, after the transport route was redirected onto the newer highway. And by the time he'd taken over the family business, it had become nothing more than another name listed in the property records. But it had been the very first link in the chain. The route had been built from this place. It had passed through this place. And when it was later expanded, rerouted, and gradually filled with more legitimate cargo to disguise what wasn't legitimate, its backbone remained the same. Backbone first driven into the ground on this farm. Years later, a man wearing a white medical coat had taken control of the other end of that same backbone, and shipments began arriving at a hospital, and somewhere inside one of those shipments were medication vials that had already been diluted. Emmett sat in the basement for a very long time, with the ledger open across his lap. Then he carried it upstairs. Otis was sitting on the porch of the little house, cleaning a set of reins. A blanket spread across his legs while the afternoon slowly faded toward evening. Emmett pulled over a small stool and sat directly in front of him, so close that their knees almost touched. He laid the ledger on the table without opening it. I found this in the basement, he said. Otis looked at the ledger, then looked back at him. My father took this land from your father, Emmett said. You already knew that. I know you knew. But I only just found out why he took it. He spoke slowly, refusing to leave out a single word. He told him about the long, empty stretch along the transport route. He told him about the cold storage building in the northeastern corner of the property. He explained how the route had expanded, how ownership had changed hands over the years, and where it had eventually led. "My father took your family's land," he said, "and then he used that very land to build the thing that, years later, carried those shipments of medication to the hospital where Harlan lay dying." Otis didn't answer. His hands remained resting quietly in his lap. "I didn't come here to ask for your forgiveness," Emmett said, his voice growing hoarse. "I don't have the right to ask. People ask for forgiveness only when they still believe they're worthy of hearing an answer. I came because I believe you deserve to know, and because I couldn't bear the thought of you leaving this world without anyone ever telling you the truth." The evening settled a little lower across the farm. In the paddock, the old chestnut horse rubbed its nose gently against the fence rail. Otis remained silent for so long that Emmett began to think he would never speak at all, and that perhaps he shouldn't. Then the old man slowly lifted his thin, weathered hand, rested it on the shoulder of the man sitting before him, and gave it the gentlest squeeze. "I'm glad you found your way home," he said. The call came on Tuesday morning, and the person on the other end gave him only an address and a time before hanging up. The restaurant was in Brooklyn and had been closed for years. In the front room, the chairs were still turned upside down on the tables, but farther inside, one long table had been set upright and covered with a clean cloth. Emmett entered, removed his coat, and walked straight to the far end of the table rather than choosing any seat closer. At the opposite end sat Camille Ferraro. She was past 60, her hair gathered into a low bun, and the only jewelry on her hand was a worn wedding ring. She was the only woman he'd ever seen sit in that chair. He walked to her, bent down, kissed the back of her hand, then returned to the far end and sat. Someone poured coffee for both of them and quietly withdrew. "Your father sat exactly where you're sitting," she said. "You hadn't even been born yet. He made me a promise, and that promise still stands today. The Castellano family never gives its records to outsiders." She took a sip of coffee. "I've heard you've had people searching the basement of the old house." "Yes." "What do you intend to do with those ledgers?" "I intend to turn them over." No one in the room moved. "Mrs. Ferraro set her cup down very gently. "For a nurse." "No, ma'am," Emmett said, "because there were people lying in hospital beds in pain while someone injected them with saline and wrote in their charts that they'd been given antibiotics. Some recovered, some didn't. She was the only person willing to sit down and count how many there were." He lowered his eyes to the table. "I know my family's name is in those ledgers. I'm not asking anyone to remove it." She studied him for a long time, with the gaze of a woman who'd attended the funerals of nearly everyone who'd once sat around that table. "Do you understand what you're asking of me?" "I'm not asking you for anything, ma'am. I only came because you sent for me." "Mrs." Ferraro tapped one finger against the tablecloth once. 10 days, she said. "During those 10 days, you clean your own house. Whatever belongs to your family, you may take and turn over as you please. Anything connected to this table stays exactly where it is. If I see a name that isn't Castellano fall from your hands, then this will no longer be your matter to handle." He stood, thanked her, and had nearly reached the door when she called after him. "The coffee here is still as good as it was when your father was alive." He drove for 2 hours back to the farm and arrived after dark. Otis was waiting in the kitchen, and on the table sat a square tin box, the kind of old cookie tin people often used to store horse brushes, with several strands of hair still clinging to the lid. Maeve stood beside it, both hands gripping the edge of the table, her face drained of color. "I thought it burned," she said. Otis pushed the tin toward Emmett. "I moved it to my house a few weeks ago," he said, as casually as though he were discussing horse feed. "That tack room has leaked for years. During the rainy season, water runs down the post and falls directly onto that shelf. I never leave papers in there. The brushes don't matter if they get wet." Emmett opened the lid. Several old brushes lay on top. Beneath them was a thick stack of photocopied documents with curled edges, and in the upper corner of every page was the date stamp from the hospital's copying machine. Maeve raised one hand to her mouth. Emmett lifted out the documents, and at the bottom of the tin there was one more thing, an envelope. The paper had yellowed, the edges had begun to crumble, and it remained sealed and unopened. 3 words had been written across the front in ballpoint pen, in a girl's rounded handwriting that leaned slightly backward. "For my big brother." Emmett didn't touch it. "I found it in the pocket of your sister's coat hanging in the tack room," Otis said, "the day after. I put it in the box. He looked down at his hands. During the first year, I sent you 2 letters. I wrote that there was something here that belonged to your sister and that you needed to come back and collect it. Both letters were returned. They'd been stamped to say there was no recipient at that address. He lifted his eyes, his voice as calm as it always was. After that, I stopped. I figured another few dozen letters would end the same way. This could only be placed directly into your hands, and for that to happen, you had to walk through that gate yourself. Emmett stood looking at the envelope for a very long time. Then he closed the lid of the tin, leaving the letter inside, and picked up the stack of photocopied documents. The hardest part of those 10 days wasn't the ledgers. The hardest part was Bernie. Maeve took the bus back into the city, sat in the kitchen of that 3rd-floor apartment for the entire afternoon, and never once spoke about justice, duty, or the people whose names filled the list. She knew those words would never move a mother raising 2 children while carrying a mortgage. Instead, she told Bernie a different story. She told her about the morning she'd gone downstairs to buy bread, when the woman behind the counter looked at her, then leaned over and whispered something to the cashier. She told her about applying for a dishwashing job at a small restaurant, getting hired, then receiving a phone call 2 days later telling her not to come back. She told her that for nearly an entire year, every time someone spoke her name, it no longer belonged to her. It belonged to another woman. One the newspapers, official reports, and endless rumors had built piece by piece. A careless nurse who'd killed her patient, and she'd been forced to live inside that stranger's name without any way to step back into her own. "You're afraid of losing your job," Maeve said. "I understand that. But listen to me. They can take your job. They can take your home. That's terrible, but those things can be rebuilt. What they took from me can't be rebuilt because it lives inside other people's minds." She pushed her cold cup of tea aside. "Keep that memory card hidden for another year. Then another. Wait until your children grow up. One day you'll look them in the eyes and teach them that honesty matters. I know you'll teach them well. But every time you do, you'll remember that sewing box." Bernie cried for nearly an hour. Then she stood, walked into her bedroom, and returned with the memory card resting in the palm of her hand. On the 10th day, Emmett walked into the federal prosecutor's office, without bringing a lawyer. He carried 2 cardboard archive boxes, placed them on the prosecutor's desk with his own hands, then sat down. He told Prosecutor Priya Raman that the 2 boxes contained his family's records relating to the refrigerated transport route, from the day it had first been established through the most recent contracts, together with the names of the intermediary company and the individuals who'd signed for the shipments at the receiving end. He said he wasn't asking for immunity. He wasn't bargaining. He wasn't requesting witness protection. Miss Raman asked whether he understood that the material he'd just placed on her desk was more than enough to prosecute him as well. He said he understood. Then, he added that he'd surrendered only the records belonging to his own family. There were no other names inside those boxes, and if she wanted information about anyone else, she wouldn't get a single answer from him. She studied him for a long moment before pulling the first archive box toward herself. That same week, the Fire Investigation Unit completed its report, and Dale Frayne was arrested at the motel on the edge of town, where he was still staying in the last room at the end of the corridor. Investigators found the receipt for the fuel can he'd purchased, and the location data from his phone placing him there during the exact time of the fire. He sat through an entire afternoon of questioning without saying a word. Then his court-appointed attorney explained that the charges against him could result in the house where his wife still lived being treated as security for any resulting civil judgment. Frayne asked only one question: "Who owns the mortgage now?" The investigators checked the records and told him that the bank had sold the loan to an investment company several weeks earlier. He sat in silence for a very long time, and at last he understood that the man who'd once stood outside his motel room hadn't threatened him at all. He'd simply prepared this road for him from the very beginning. Frayne confessed. He admitted he'd been hired to locate Maeve Sullivan. He gave the name of the person who'd hired him. He explained how the payments had been routed. He admitted that setting fire to the barn had been his own decision, made in panic, and that no one had ordered him to do it. Bernie turned over the memory card the following day, accompanied by an attorney from the nurses' union. Once the surveillance footage was placed beside the transportation records and the copied medication dispensing log, the 3 pieces fit together like the broken parts of a single bone. The person who'd entered the pharmacy that night was the head of pharmacy operations, and his name appeared on the payroll of the intermediary company. From that moment on, everything collapsed in sequence. One person testified against another in exchange for lighter sentences, and in less than 2 weeks, Curtis Halloway's name appeared on the search warrant, authorizing investigators to enter the office of the medical director at Mercy General Hospital. The letter withdrawing every charge arrived on an ordinary morning, tucked between the heating oil bill and an advertisement from the farm supply store. A backup copy of the medical record system had been restored, and the original dosage entry was still there, exactly as it had been written, the correct amount, the correct time, signed Maeve Sullivan. 3 weeks later, the state nursing board reinstated her license and enclosed a formal letter of apology printed on paper bearing its official seal. There was one other thing inside the envelope, the plastic name badge they'd taken from her on the day of her suspension. Its surface scratched, and the pin on the back bent out of shape. She didn't put it on. She held it in her hand all morning, then borrowed the pickup truck and drove to the cemetery south of the city, to the grave marked by the small stone bearing the name of the woman who'd once called her daughter. She sat down on the grass, placed the name badge on the headstone, and remained there through the entire afternoon, speaking aloud to no one, telling the whole story from the beginning, including the parts she'd never told another living soul. She didn't pick the badge up until darkness had fallen. Then she wiped it against the hem of her shirt and slipped it into her pocket. She didn't pin it over her heart until the following morning. But on the other side of the story, events took a turn no one at the farm had expected. The prosecutor offered Emmett a deal, an extraordinarily generous agreement that came close to granting him complete immunity, provided he gave full testimony about the entire network and supplied the names of everyone who'd managed each part of it through all those years. He read the agreement twice, then pushed it back across the table. He said the list included drivers, warehouse workers, and people who'd signed papers without ever knowing what was inside the shipments, and they had families, and if their names were read aloud, their lives would be over. He pleaded guilty to a charge connected to concealing the source of the money, and the court sentenced him to nearly 2 years in federal prison. Maeve waited for him in the corridor outside the courtroom. She grabbed his sleeve and told him to go back inside and sign the agreement, to sign it right then, and that she would tell them he hadn't known anything. He gently freed his arm from her grasp, then held her hand in his. "Do you know what makes you different from everyone I've ever known?" he said. "I've spent my life around people who tell the truth when the truth serves them. You told the truth at the exact moment it cost you everything, and you kept telling it. I watched you do that. I can't love you and still be more of a coward than you are." Their first visit took place through a pane of glass reinforced with wire mesh. She raised the hand that still carried the burn scar and pressed it against the glass, and he placed his hand over the same spot from the other side. "I'll wait for you," she said. "Don't wait," he replied. "Live. When I get out, I'll come looking for you wherever you're saving people, and I'll find you." That winter passed in letters, one every week, without a single week missed. She told him the old chestnut had finally allowed Otis to brush its left side, that the barn roof had been rebuilt with new sheets of metal, and that the snow had grown so deep they had to clear the path twice a day. He told her he was teaching an older prisoner how to read and write, that the man learned slowly, but when he finally managed to write his wife's name, he cried. Not one of their letters mentioned his release date, because neither of them could bear to count. When spring came, the old stable was converted into a free clinic for farm workers and uninsured people across the 3 neighboring counties, and Maeve named it after Emmett's late sister. Bernie left the hospital for good, moved up to the farm, and became the clinic's second nurse. On opening day, the line stretched all the way to the gate, and Maeve stood on the steps and read aloud the letter he'd sent, a letter only 4 lines long that didn't mention him once. From then on, every Saturday morning, Otis offered free riding lessons in the eastern paddock for children from the surrounding area, and their laughter carried all the way to the fence. One late summer afternoon, Otis called Maeve into the kitchen and placed a folded sheet of paper on the table. It was the report from his heart examination the previous autumn, from before the day she'd walked through the gate. She read it, and she understood immediately what those few lines meant, because she'd read hundreds of reports just like it during her years as a nurse. She looked up at him. The day he came back, Otis said, "He told you it was because I never answered the phone." That was true. But it wasn't because I couldn't hear it. I let it ring. I sat right beside that telephone and let it ring for 3 straight months. He slowly turned the cup in his hands. For 9 years, he called every single month. Every month he asked about the horses, asked about the roof, asked whether I needed anything, and then he hung up. 9 years like that. I knew him well enough by then. It didn't matter how many times I invited him. He would have never come home. The only way to make him walk back through that gate was to make him afraid. He looked down at the report on the table. I'm sorry I frightened him, but I was an old man, and I couldn't wait any longer. That autumn, the transfer of ownership was finally completed. Larkspur Hollow became jointly owned property. And for the first time in many years, the Doyle name appeared beside the Castellano name on the cover of the official file. The agreement contained one clause that Emmett himself had written from prison and mailed out in a letter, stating that the land could never be sold to any real estate developer under any circumstances, and that if a day ever came when neither family had anyone left, ownership must pass to the clinic's charitable foundation. Otis sat at the kitchen table holding the document bearing his father's name for a very long time. His hands trembled, and it was the only moment in this entire story when anyone ever saw him cry. The man Maeve had once been about to marry called her once after everything became public. He spoke for a long time, apologized again and again, explained the pressure he'd been under and the position he'd occupied back then. She listened to every word without interrupting him once. Then she thanked him for calling, ended the conversation, and never thought about that phone call again. On the day Emmett was released from prison, only one person was waiting outside the gate. There was no celebration, no welcoming crowd, only the wire gate opening, then closing quietly behind him beneath the clear September morning sky. Across the road stood Otis's old pickup truck, and Maeve leaned against the driver's door wearing a white medical coat, the scratched plastic name badge pinned over her heart. They didn't speak throughout the first part of the drive home. When they arrived at the farm, he sat down on the porch steps, and she brought out the old tin box. He opened the letter that had rested inside it for 9 long years. It contained only a few lines, written in rounded handwriting that leaned gently backward. Big brother, I know you'll be late. You're always late. But I also know you'll come, breathless and exhausted, and you'll still come. I'm writing this so that the next time you're late, you won't hate yourself for it anymore. Arriving late is still better than never arriving at all, isn't it? He sat there for a very long time with the letter in his hands, while she sat quietly beside him without saying a word. Finally, she rested her hand on his knee. You saved me, she whispered. He slowly shook his head. No. You walked into an abandoned stable and filled it with warmth. I was only the one who arrived afterward and realized that I'd been living in the cold all those years too. This story leaves us with a few simple truths. A person's worth isn't measured by the wealth they possess, nor by what official records or public rumors say about them. It's measured by the part of themselves they refuse to sell. Kindness offered to a stranger is never truly lost. Sometimes it travels a very long road before returning at the exact moment we need saving the most. The debts handed down by those who came before us are no different. They don't disappear with time. They simply change addresses until someone brave enough finally chooses to repay them. If today's story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so we can continue listening together to more stories of kindness every day. We'd also love to hear what you think about Emmett, Maeve, and Otis, so please leave us a comment and share whatever is in your heart. We genuinely want to hear your thoughts. We wish each of you watching this video good health, joyful days, and many peaceful years, surrounded by the people you love. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in our next video.